I cannot stand this Queen Victoria character. I mean, I get that she's playing it up for the show, but she is so far out in left field. I just can't even wrap my head around it. But I finished watching episode 2, and I don't want to make this whole review about Queen Victoria, but she's the one that just freaking drives me nuts. But so I'll give you sort of high-level things that I thought were interesting. The first is Matt had a private date with Bree, and it went wonderfully. They went out on an ATV. He turns to her while they're riding the ATV together and says, "Do you trust me?" And she's like, "Yeah." And then he proceeds to spin the thing out, flip it over on her, and they play in the bog of mud. And, of course, like all is fine. Like that's just like a playful thing that happens between, two lovers. And I was thinking like that my personal relationship is in a very different place, because if I turned to my wife and said, "Do you trust me?" and then proceeded to flip the ATV, we'd have a very different conversation. But they survived it. They felt very connected. They got to have a cool hot tub time. So that was great. But when Matt was on this date with Bree, Queen Victoria was really upset with the lack of time with Matt. And I think that she sort of didn't understand how the Bachelor worked, because I think she thought she was going to get all the private meetings, but she was outraged at the fact that he would go on a private date with somebody other than her. So she's like complaining to all the other women, like, "Can you believe that he's on a date and it's not with me?" And she started like attacking the other women for not being outraged at the fact that Matt was on this date with Bree. And then she turned, and the other women were like, "Okay, you're crazy. You're on The Bachelor, so get used to it." And then she got mad at them for not being equally outraged. And it was like this weird sort of thing that's happening with her. I think like I want to come in here and say like, here's my diagnosis for her. And I've not totally wrapped my head around how I would describe her. Like, I think it's too simple just to say that she's, borderline. I mean, something's going on. What I can tell you is I think that she's incredibly insecure, and her way of managing her insecurity is to attack other people. She creates interpersonal friction around her. I think she doesn't have to worry about herself, how she looks, how she acts, how she's really being perceived, right? She takes control of the conflict and the interaction, and it allows her to sort of push off any kind of actual introspection. So after the date, Matt comes back and he's having little smaller dates with different women. One woman goes and says, "I'm so happy that I'm spending this extra time with you, but I want to be really, like, the show is all about," everybody talks about vulnerability. And it's like, if you really had a hard time with vulnerability, like you probably wouldn't go on The Bachelor to air out all your dirty laundry. Like, they're pretty, like, I don't know if I would categorize it as real vulnerability, but she wants to overshare all of her experiences. And so she goes, "My experience is I've really struggled with men that haven't been totally faithful. Monogamy is really important to me." And Matt's like, "Yeah, I hear that and I see that, and I would never do that to you. Is there anything that I can do, to like sort of demonstrate for you like how I'm a monogamous guy?" And she's like, "Well, I think a makeout would help." And he's like, "Yeah." And there's like, no, I feel like I wish the two of them would step back for a second and go like, this is kind of ironic, right? Because there's 23 women that are out there waiting for me. I've made out with half of them today, and I'm going to make out the other half of them later on today. And then Matt gets his time with Queen Victoria, and it's her opportunity to be vulnerable. And she meets that need in spades, and she turns to him and she goes, like, I want you to know that I'm not just like this strong woman. I'm not just always like in control, and I'm not always perfect. And I'm sure he's thinking, I didn't think you were those things, but okay. And then she goes, sometimes I do have insecurities, and I was worried about how I looked in the dress, and, I worry about some things. And he's like, oh, I love the vulnerability. And like, I really appreciate the fact that you shared this, major secret with me, as though not everybody there has that kind of, minor insecurity about how they look, etc. But what's annoying about that is that he then goes and has a meeting with Sarah, whose dad has ALS, and it's like Sarah has given up her entire professional life to go back home to go take care of her dad who has ALS, and she's having difficulty talking about that. And Matt senses that there's something more there from Sarah. And he's, in the background, the narration is, I just feel like I'm not getting enough out of her, and she's not sharing enough, and I want these women to be vulnerable, and that's kind of like the requirement to be on this show. And it's like all of a sudden we're equating Queen Victoria saying, sometimes I don't feel comfortable in what I wear, with this woman who's talking about like a real trauma in her life. Her dad was given 5 years to live, and he's like at 5.5 years right now. He's going to pass away really soon. It's like this devastating piece of who she is, and she has to be really transparent about that. And I sort of want to be like, hey, Matt, there's like a significant difference here. There's real and true vulnerability, and I hope that people watching the show captured the fact that that was true vulnerability versus the other kind of crap that's out there with this sort of acting as if we're going to be vulnerable and worried and fearful and all these other things. And then there's even more drama at the end of the show. Queen Victoria, and I don't know if I actually call her Queen Victoria or Queen or whatever, but this crazy character turns around and goes to Matt and says, I just want to be really transparent with you. Marilyn is a real bitch and has been bullying me in the house. And she's just harassing me. I couldn't sleep in the room. And it's like this totally fabricated idea that Marilyn had somehow been picking on her, which she absolutely hasn't. What's remarkable to me is I thought that Queen would come back to the camera talking to us and go, look, this is a game. My goal here is to win The Bachelor. And so if I can eliminate someone, I'll do so. And so, I talked negatively about X person and hopefully she's gone. And that helps kind of how I rank in the show. But she didn't. She turned to the viewers at home and goes, yeah, I've been bullied and I'm defending myself. And then she turns to the women on the show and goes, hey, you should support me. I called her out for bullying me. And everybody on the show is like, are you out of your mind? This poor woman hasn't bullied anybody. And Queen just sort of digs her heels in and just gaslights the entire group. Yes, she's been bullying me, and I can't believe you guys aren't supporting me, and you all are crazy. I mean, it feels like the most manipulative behavior. And what's striking to me is I genuinely think that Queen believes that she was being bullied. I think that Queen doesn't recognize that she's created all of the drama in the house, which is like, it's a psychological study on its own. So drama filled. And then at the very end of the show, Sarah, they're like, he's passing out roses to everybody. And Sarah, who has already gotten a rose, all of a sudden starts to faint. And then we cut to episode 3 coming up next. So I don't know what happens, but it was definitely a good action-filled, drama-filled episode 2. I am still in on The Bachelor. Thanks for listening.